Hey everybody, hope we're doing well today. We're going to go ahead and get started on our new topic that is going to take us through this week and probably part of next week as well. Mitosis and meiosis, cell division, and cell growth. um, Before I get started, I want to just say, I may have to clear my throat and I might cough a couple of times during this video. I'm okay, but I just want to forewarn you that that might happen a couple of times throughout the video. So just excuse that. Okay, so mitosis, meiosis, cell division, cell growth. So this is an important unit. It's going to talk about the reproduction of cells and how certain organisms come to life, come to be, how humans develop from the time that we become gametes and the gametes meet by the time when we become fertilized, when sperm and egg meet, and then we end up developing into a fetus and then into a human. That's covered in this topic as well. So this is important stuff, and I'm gonna do my best to give you all the information you need. So make sure you're following along. Make sure you're using your guided notes. Again, this is video, so stop, rewind, do what you got to do to make sure you get that info. Feel free to leave us comments or questions on the video themselves on Classroom, or email myself or Miss Steele with any questions that you have. All right. So let's get started with mitosis and meiosis. So the first thing that we're really going to talk about is cell growth, right? The question that we have is, why do cells divide, right? Instead of dividing, why don't cells just grow larger and larger and larger? I encourage you to pause the video and think about this question about how come we need to have a cell, right? Think of a cell like a circle. How come that circle has to cut itself in half and divide into two in order to keep growing? Why can't that one cell just keep expanding and expanding and growing infinitely? How come it can't do that? Well, there are a couple of reasons that we're going to get into in a second, but in short, the reason that it can't do that is because it just doesn't make sense on a DNA level and on an energy level. Think about think about a human, right? If you kept growing, or if I kept growing for my entire life, right, up until however old I was, 100 years old, right? We just kept growing and growing and growing. What would that put on my body? That would be a strain on my organs. It would be a strain on my DNA. It would require massive amounts of energy, right? If people were able to grow 15, 20, 30 feet tall, now you have your heart that has to pump blood 30 feet up and 30 feet down, right? You need to have bigger lungs in order to bring in more oxygen. It would just take a toll on the body. Cells work very similarly in that they need to divide, because if they kept growing, they wouldn't be able to function properly due to their increased size. All right, so let's take a look at the exact reasons, right? So as we said before, there are two main reasons why cells divide rather than continue to grow larger and larger. For one, if the cell grows too large, it will have trouble moving enough nutrients and wastes across the cell membrane. So think about when we learned about organelles. The cell membrane's main job, right, is to control what brings things in and what brings things out of the cell. It acts as the barrier, it surrounds the cell, and it controls what enters. If you have a cell that continues to grow and expand, that cell membrane is also going to expand, and now you're going to have a humongous cell. The problem is now cells need to bring in nutrients. They need to bring in proteins. They have to bring in oxygen. They need to remove waste. It becomes very difficult to move those things across a very large cell. It's going to take much longer. So that's one reason why they need to divide, because if they didn't, they wouldn't be able to get those nutrients and wastes in and out. They would eventually die. The second reason, right, is that the larger the cell becomes, the more demand it places on DNA. Now, we didn't really learn about DNA yet. That's in our next unit in genetics, but we do know that DNA controls everything, right? And we do know that that's in the nucleus. So the larger a cell, the larger an organism, the more the DNA needs to work, right? Think of the DNA like your brain. So these are the two main reasons why. Now, just to go into a little more depth with one of these problems, our DNA has limits, right? So DNA, remember, is all the information that our body needs in order to function. And that's exactly our first bullet, right? So all the information that a cell needs to function is stored in the DNA of a cell. Now, DNA is packaged into chromosomes, and each chromosome consists of one long linear DNA molecule that has thousands of genes, right? So we're looking at something like this, where this line right here, that's one linear line that has thousands of DNA, thousands of genes on it. And then this other one here, which twists around it, is also another one. Now, one important thing to remember about DNA is that our cells continuously make copies of these DNA and these genes. They continuously do, right? Every time cells split, every time DNA splits, it makes a copy of itself. Now, this slide right here is just an intro to what we're going to learn. We are going to learn about DNA replication and about a couple of other important DNA facts in our next unit. So I just wanted to show you this, but we're not going to focus on this slide right this second. Okay. So we are going to focus on this one, right? So a growing cell needs more food, right? So take a look at this picture here. You have a cell, right? It's in there. It's a little circle. And then you have a membrane. Now in this picture, the membrane is just depicted as a square. We know that that's not the case, but it is depicted as a square just so you could see it grow. Look at what happens between these three pictures. The cell itself, the circle, doesn't change in size. It stays the same size the entire time. What does change, though, is the membrane, right? And we're going to learn about that down here. So a cell must take in a constant inflow of food, oxygen, and water. We know about that. The membrane brings in food, it brings oxygen, it brings water, it allows the cell to grow. And in reverse, the waste products must cross that membrane as well to leave the cell, right? We said before, our first problem, if a cell that grows larger and it just continues to expand, it's going to obviously need more food, more oxygen, more water because it's bigger. And it's then going to grow and generate more waste. The bigger the organism, the bigger the cell, the more waste is produced. Right? Think of it even as animals. Waste, compare the waste of an elephant to the waste of a mouse, right? It's not comparable, right? Because the size of the organism dictates how much waste is produced. So when we talk about cells, when the cell grows, the volume of the cell, right, increases more rapidly than the surface area of the cell membrane, right? And what that simply means is that the membrane is not going to keep up with the growth. It's just gonna grow and it's gonna keep growing, and it's eventually going to get too large, right? And that just means that it won't be adequate anymore. Just look at this again, right? This is all just depicting what we're seeing here. The cell stays the same, the membrane gets larger. Now you have a cell that requires a certain amount of food, a certain amount of water, a certain amount of oxygen, but your membrane is too big. So it's going to take much longer to get those things in, and it's going to take much longer to remove those wastes out. So this is just another picture and another way to think about that problem that we have if cells keep growing. Okay. So let's actually talk a little bit about cell division now. So cell division is defined as the process by which cellular material is divided between two new daughter cells, right? And we're going to learn what mother and daughter cells are in a second. It's very simple. So in cell division, what occurs is simply this. You start off with one cell. It's the mother cell. It's the cell that is going to split, right? it splits into two daughter cells. The important thing to remember about cell division when we talk about mitosis, which is what we're talking about right now, or what we're going to be talking about in a second, is cell division causes identical replication, duplication, whatever you want to call it. It's identical to the mother cell. Okay? So that's something important to remember. That's not always the case, but if we're talking about mitosis, it is. Cell division, right? You have one mother cell that splits into two daughter cells. Each one of these daughter cells right here is exactly the same as the mother. It has the same exact DNA. It has the same exact size. It has the same exact everything. It is the same cell. You could think of this one cell just splitting itself into two and creating two. Now, what would end up happening is this one would split and create its own two. This one would create its own two. That one would create its own, that one, and it would just continue on and on and on. Cell division continues and doesn't stop. But what you need to remember is that the one mother cell will split into two daughter cells, each of which are identical to the mother cell. Okay? So each daughter cell initially is half the size of the parent cell, but will immediately begin to grow, right? So if we go back to this slide, you'll see that they look a little smaller. Eventually, they're going to get to this same size. And again, they still stay identical as far as genetics are concerned. They have the same DNA. But back to here. Each daughter is half the size of the parent cell, but immediately begins to grow. Just a couple of things to know about DNA. A typical human cell has about 2 meters of DNA. That's a lot of DNA for a cell that's microscopic. What's important to know is that before the cell can divide, its DNA must be copied, right? And then the two copies separate so that each daughter cell ends up with a complete set of DNA. This is important to remember. Think about it logically. If you are trying to split yourself in half and then create 2 new copies of yourself, you have to first copy your DNA, because if you don't, how is it going to be transferred to your new copies, right? It won't. You need to do that first. So we're going to learn about that when we talk about the phases of mitosis, but just keep in mind DNA replication occurs before the cell splits. All right, this is very important. This is commonly asked on the Regents, and it's just something that you're going to continuously see no matter the class that you take, if it's science related, if it's genetics, biology. Chromosome number. Each species has a very characteristic number of chromosomes. Humans, dogs, plants, peas, celery, anything that's living will have its own DNA number, but we are just primarily focused on humans. We have 46 chromosomes total, 23 pairs, right? What that means is we get 23 chromosomes from our mother, and we get 23 chromosomes from our father, for a total of 46. That is why we are exactly half of our mother, half of our father. We get DNA from each of them, 50% from each. So just remember those numbers. I promise you, you are going to have to see this and know this at some point. It will come up. So make sure you know that. 23 pairs, 23 from mom, 23 from dad, 46 total. Okay. All right. So eukaryotic cell division. So we should all remember what eukaryotes are, right? We learned about eukaryotes. We learned about prokaryotes. This is way back to our organelles and our cells. Look back on your notes. If you don't remember what those are, you still need to remember that. It comes up all the time, right? So each cell, like we said before, must first copy its chromosomes before cell division occurs, right? Each daughter will get a complete copy of that information. So that's going back to this picture here, where we have one eukaryotic cell that will split. Before it splits, it copies its DNA, all these blue squiggly lines. And because it copies the DNA first, it splits into two, and each daughter cell gets a complete copy of that DNA. There we are. Cell division occurs in two main stages, mitosis and cytokinesis. Mitosis and cytokinesis. Now, mitosis is the division of the nucleus, while cytokinesis is the division of the cytoplasm. When you have a cell that needs to split into two, really you have two parts that are splitting. You have the nucleus, the inner portion, and then you have the membrane, the cytoplasm, which is everything around it, that needs to split as well. So it happens in two stages. Mitosis has about a couple of stages in its own, which we're going to see in a bit. But these are the two main stages of cell division, mitosis and cytokinesis. All right. So just a couple of things that we're going to look at here. We will get back to this again. So, we're going to go through it. A couple of these things may not make sense immediately, but they will in our upcoming videos. So chromosomes are not visible except during cell division. So chromosomes are microscopic. You can't see them. But when cell division starts, you are able to see them because they condense and they become very compact. So you can see that with a microscope if you were to look at a cell as it was undergoing cell division. So again, we have in blue, before cell division, chromosomes, DNA are replicated or copied. That comes up. You see how that's coming up very often because that's an important thing to remember. DNA replication, chromosome replication happens before cell division. Okay. And then we have sister chromatids and centromeres. So you can just fill this in for now. We're going to get back to what this is in a little bit. Right. So the cell cycle. Now, this is an incredibly important part. We're going to actually end the video after we do the cell cycle. We're not going to get into mitosis today, but we are going to just discuss what the cell cycle is. So the cell cycle is what it's the term that encompasses cell growth and cell division. So we've been talking about cell division. We've been talking about cell growth. We mentioned mitosis. This is really what mitosis is. This is the cycle that a cell goes through when it is about to replicate itself, when it's going to split, right? So again, as a definition, the cell cycle is the life of the cell from the time it is first formed from a dividing parent cell until its own division into two cells, right? So right here, we're going to jump back to this picture quite a lot. This picture here is the parent cell. It undergoes the cell cycle and it splits into two. This one would then go under the cell cycle and split into two, as with this one, as would all of the subsequent cells. So the cell cycle, again, is the life from the time it first forms until it divides into its own two cells. During the cell cycle, three things happen, very important. The cell will grow, the cell will prepare itself to divide, and then the cell will actually divide and form those two new cells that we saw. All right. So we're going to quickly just talk about the phases of the cell cycle, so you could see what those are. All right. So there are 5 major phases of the cell cycle. Guys, this is important. Please memorize these names. You have to know the stages, and you have to know the order that they occur in. I'm going to say that one more time. You must know the stages of mitosis, right? Which we'll get to in a second. But you also need to remember the entire overall cell cycle. It's important that you know that, right? This whole unit is going to talk about these phases. That's what a bulk of this unit is. It goes into depth, and we talk about what happens in each one. So you need to know the names of them. You need to know the order that they occur in, because there is a specific order. The cell cycle does not go out of order, right? And you're going to have to know what happens in each, but we will get to that. For now, just make sure you remember the names and the order. So it's 5 major phases. You have G1 phase, which is the first gap phase. You have the S phase. S stands for synthesis. Make sure you remember that, because that will help you remember what happens in the S phase, right? We've already learned what synthesis is. We've spoken about that word before. You should remember that it means the creation of something, right? To synthesize is to make something. So when we learn about what happens in the S phase, that will be handy. You then have the G2 phase. You then have mitosis occur, which is this little line here, and then you have cytokinesis occur, which is right here. So the order in which these things occur is this order. G1 comes first, it's the first gap, then you have synthesis, then you have the G2, then mitosis, then cytokinesis. Also, while you are looking at these, also notice the size of them, right? Because that is intentional, right? They didn't just make this any specific size. G1 is the longest phase. It takes the longest time. S phase comes after that. That is the second longest. G2 is, still pretty long, but shorter than these two. And then mitosis and cytokinesis are both very quick. So just keep that in mind as well. Okay, so let's take a look a little more in depth. So before a cell can begin mitosis and actually divide, right? So before it gets to here, it needs to do a couple of things. So it must form duplicates of its chromosomes. Remember, this is now the 10th time that I'm mentioning this and repeating myself. The DNA must be duplicated before it splits, before it divides. And it also must produce a supply of organelles for the 2 daughter cells. Remember, this cell over here is a complete cell with organelles in it and with DNA. These 2 daughter cells are also complete cells with the same DNA and the same organelles. So we need to make sure that both the organelles and the DNA get replicated so that they can each be passed on. So these things that we're talking about happens in the G1, the S, and the G2 phases. And that's why they're the longest phases. That's why I said that these take the longest time, because this is where all the preparation to replicate the DNA and to replicate the organelles takes place. It happens in these 3 phases. So it takes a lot longer, right? Collectively, and this is the first thing that you're learning about mitosis, G1, S, and G2 are all known as interphase. Interphase, make sure you know that. Interphase is G1, S, and G2. So you could see on a test where they can ask you what occurs in interphase during a cell, right? And you'll have to know that G1, S, and G2 occur in interphase in a cell. You may also not have G1, S, and G2 as options. They may ask you to write out as a short answer what occurs in interphase. And you're going to say the following. In the G1 phase, the cell doubles in size, and then the enzymes, organelles, and other molecules double. So during the G1 phase, which, remember, is the longest phase, right? During G1, the cell will double, and then all the organelles will also double, okay? So this is where that occurs. The S phase is the replication of DNA. Remember, I told you the S phase stands for synthesis. They are synthesizing DNA in the S phase. Very important to remember. So in the S phase, this is where the DNA gets copied. And remember, that comes before mitosis. And in the G2 phase, the cell will assemble special structures needed for cell division. This is general. We are not going to get into more depth than that. It can become very complicated. All you need to know is that the G2 phase produces structures that help the cell divide, right? And again, all 3 of these phases combined is called interphase. Okay? Once interphase is complete, the cell is ready to begin the actual division process known as mitosis. All right? So I'm going to quickly just go through that one more time. You have G1, S, G2, then you have mitosis, cytokinesis. G1, S, and G2 are all known as interphase. G1, the cell doubles, the organelles double. S, DNA is replicated. G2, special structures are made. This is all interphase. When interphase is over, you can move on to mitosis and then eventually on to cytokinesis. So what we did today was we learned about the cell cycle, and we specifically learned about cell division. We learned about why cells divide the way that they do. We also learned about interphase, the first three parts of the cell cycle. And once we're done with interphase, we can move on to